Hello again. This is GJ Woods. I've got a brand new story for you. Really only finished a few days ago. I hope you enjoy it. It's called The Man Who Had Flowers for Eyes. Marcel Bee thought it was conjunctivitis. Like blood into seawater, the blue of his eyes pinked by degrees, day by day, until they became very red indeed. Marcel could only think of albino rabbits, the crimson of their eyes so much more vivid due to the whiteness of their fur. He purchased drops from a walk-in clinic, but they didn't work. In fact, when he applied them, they seemed to roll off his eyeballs like water on grease. The chemist at the walk-in said, "Oh yes, they are quite red, that's for sure," when Marcel returned a second time, and he, unsure as to what else to do, just agreed with her. Best to go to the doctors, the chemist recommended. Marcel obliged. He couldn't remember the last time he'd ever visited the surgery. Marcel could not even remember the last time he was ill, even a cold. Nothing. He was not a man who endured illness. It seemed to bypass him. When Marcel met colleagues at work who were sniffling, retching, coughing or clammy, he was polite, said hello and wished them well, then went about his own business at the data core, shuffling about in the vortex, completing his duties, without ever becoming ill. Marcel couldn't claim to be impervious to sickness, that would be absurd. But he could legitimately testify to the fact that illness for him was rarer than finding love on a battlefield. The waiting room of the doctors was a din of screaming babies and hacking coughs. Marcel smiled politely at those with whom he made eye contact, observing their swollen glands, throbbing necks and gloopy eyes. His own eyes, marginally lessened in severity by the tint of his glasses, had not only continued to redden, but had now begun to attain a thin crust, not unlike the gathered sands of sleep that occur when someone has slumbered deeply for a very long time. The doctor looked at Marcel studiously. "It's probably an infection," it said after a few moments. "Something bacterial. You've picked it up from a colleague maybe, or from rubbing your eyes when your hands have touched a filthy surface. Picking up a cigarette from the pavement maybe?" "Excuse me," Marcel said, offended. "Oh," the doctor replied, "that's just a vague scenario, of course, for example purposes. I don't mean anything by it. I'm sure you could quite as easily have imbibed the infection after trying to prize a low-value coin from a gap in the gutter, probably near to a fast food outlet." "I don't eat that stuff," Marcel replied. "But the coins, though, I'm sure you would pick up a coin if you saw one, even with a low value." "I probably wouldn't." Marcel stood and began to leave. "Look," the doctor replied, "it's just an infection. Common in people who may or may not have dirty fingers." Marcel didn't reply. He just took the basic prescription issued to him and returned to the chemist. He was quite certain that the standard of medical care had deteriorated since the implementation of automated practitioners. The last time he'd visited a surgery, the doctor had been human, and whilst not truly effective, they were at least made from flesh and urine. By the time Marcel awoke the next morning, the coatings had enveloped his eyes entirely. They were scabs, really. Two crusted umbrellas covering the rain clouds of his vision. Oddly, even though he could tap the awful surfaces and hear a reply, he could actually see quite well, with only a faint blur caused by the scabs. Staring at himself in the bathroom mirror and in the several other mirrors of his rooms, Marcel saw his reflection as something insect-like. The contagion seemed to widen his eyes a great deal, and truly thinking more of a fly than the insect that shared his surname, Marcel Bee was at least grimly amused by the idea. Feeling the onset of a fever, though, Marcel contacted Datacore and explained that he would need to stay off work for at least a day, possibly more. Marcel waited patiently for the investigative device to arrive at his door, and once the machine had taken his blood and catalogued the condition with several photographs, it whistled off back down the hallway of his building, hovering there momentarily ahead of the lift until the doors opened and it vanished. Marcel pictured the small appliance rushing back to Datacore, weaving in and out of pedestrians, metros, and of course identical devices conducting their audits of the city's various personnel. Feeling dizzied by the idea as well as the fever, Marcel decided to take to his bed. He drank 4 small glasses of purified water, ate a section of protein, and fell almost immediately to sleep. It was night when Marcel awoke. Deep night, the witching hours. The permanent neon that tinted the sky beyond Marcel's rooms meant that no stars were visible, but the noises differed at night. The aching gears of the transportation hoist were not to be heard between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m. It was city ordnance. so Marcel was reasonably sure of the time before he commanded his lights to activate. The first thing he noticed was the scabs. They were on his pillow. Laying there like two petrified eggs, the thick crust had fallen away entirely. Marcel felt his face. Instinctively he froze. His fingertips warned of delicate protrusions, something gentle but prominent, like cosmetic eyelashes or recently washed hair. He blinked and felt the strange additions move in time with his eyelids. Dashing from his bed, Marcel charged into the bathroom. The lights ignited with his motion and he held himself in front of the mirror and flowers. They were flowers. Believing that he was locked in the hazy manacles of a nightmare, Marcel hurled handfuls of cold water at his face and then stared again. Not only did the flowers remain, but they seemed to respond to Marcel watering them, with the petals glowing resplendent yellow. Marcel blinked and the petals reacted, closing inwards and then opening once more. He widened his eyes as much as his tendons and muscles would allow, and of course the petals enlarged, exposing the filaments of the stamen, his pupils. Small fuzzy cotton-like bulbs seemed to have replaced his retinas. Marcel gently pulled at one of the petals and saw that it did not dislodge, but rather tugged at the flesh behind it, as if he was simply pulling at his own skin. The fact that Marcel could see clearly, perhaps clearer than he'd ever been able to see before, meant that this worry was predominantly confined to the aesthetic. He had flowers for eyes, that was the fact. Oddly, as if he wished to define the condition further, Marcel opened an encyclopedia and scanned his eyes, one at a time. The results were immediate. Tulips. The screen said with a reported 98.7% reliability that Marcel Bee, quite simply, now had tulips for eyes. Now Marcel managed to hide much of the flowers with the wraparound sunglasses. Owing to the rates of dangerous neon in the city's atmosphere, it was not unusual to see pedestrians wearing full goggles. So Marcel picked up a registered visor and proceeded to the surgery. The automaton practitioner surveyed Marcel's face without surprise, as if it was entirely incapable of expressing such emotions. Just the facts. You have tulips for eyes, the doctor reported. Thank you, but I am quite aware of that. My question would be, what on earth is happening to me and can you treat it? Tulips, the doctor continued, require generous sunlight and moisture. Marcel shook his head. I understand that too, but why have I got flowers for eyes? Can you see? The doctor asked. I can, clearly, very much so. Then it's purely cosmetic. But I don't think I want flowers for eyes, Marcel argued. What, like some people have birthmarks? Or albinos? The doctor replied. It isn't the same, Marcel snapped. I didn't have flowers for eyes yesterday. The automaton paused, the response generated from its speakers. Well, yes, I understand, but the same could be said for the person who reports to the cancer camps with a tumour that has just appeared. Marcel stood. Are you saying this is cancer? Not at all. Please relax. If the flowers are malignant, then they'll increase in size and spread, but for now you can simply monitor the situation. I want a second opinion, Marcel shouted. We practitioners are a medical hive mind, Mr. B. We share the same encyclopedic directory. But I've got flowers for eyes. Then, the doctor replied, perhaps your second opinion should be from a florist. Work at Data Core quickly became intolerable. It was impossible to filter the data stacks with constant questions about his eyes. Even with Marcel wearing a visor that covered all but the very tips of the petals, relentless requests to see garden face or bouquet head continued to pour in. The last straw came when several colleagues approached Marcel, led by the intolerably arrogant prick Harper Skillard. Chuckling as he asked the question, Skillard said, Sadly, one of the company's directors passed away last week, Marcel. My colleagues and I were wondering if it's not too much trouble, if you'd like to contribute to a wreath. With your face. Marcel took a leave of absence. Until such a time that he ceased to be an oddity or was able to redress the flowers in his eyes, he would need to remain away from work. Not wanting undue distraction from the task of data farming, his managers were only too happy to agree. They immediately drafted in a synthetic replacement to cover Marcel's work and his absenteeism. At least the copy wouldn't be able to grow flowers in his eyes. In the days that followed, Marcel became naturally withdrawn. It was hard to bring himself to go to the food halls or to any of the chatter trough eateries he would usually frequent. Even the bars, the pubs of the city's underground chandelier-lit subways made him feel self-conscious and ultimately void in a social sense. On the morning of the 5th day, Marcel noticed that the petals of his eyes were browning. By midday, Marcel could tell that the flowers were dying. Rather than the petals falling away, however, they were simply curling into decomposition, but as tightly fixed to his eyes as they had ever been. This was increasingly frustrating. Marcel wrapped himself in a sheet, took a dose of Drowse Plus, and fell into a deep sleep. When he awoke, his eyes felt altogether sorer. He raised a hand to them, and his probing finger was immediately pricked. Hurrying to the bathroom once more, Marcel was surprised to see that his eyes had now become cacti. Now Marcel stared at the tiny protuberances and he began to sob. The tears appeared in small globular pearls at the tips of his cacti. The tears did at least have something of a positive impact. Tiny yet vividly white flowers began to bloom from the deep green of the cacti. They were desert flowers, and somehow, even with Marcel's heavy sadness aside, they were poignant in their beauty. This development changed Marcel's outlook from downcast to whimsy. Whilst the apparently ever-changing state of his eye gardens was a maddening encumbrance, Marcel was a pragmatist at heart and believed in some level of circumspection. He therefore found that, against all odds, he was trying to see the positives of his dilemma. Medical science would not help him. He was fortunate to have been able to receive consultation from one of the automated practitioners, considering that his meagre medical care plan only entitled him to a maximum of 1 sickness symposium per calendar year, barring catastrophic emergencies, of course, such as the loss of a limb or the agonised swelling of census-listed genitals. Marcel decided to go out. His visor rested somewhat uncomfortably over the distended bulbs of the cacti. They hung like spectacles on the nose of a haughty librarian. Marcel tried to ignore any notions of vanity or appearance. What did it matter, he asked himself? Who should truly care about a man with flowers for eyes in a city of such busy, grotesque and increasingly bizarre invention? This, he felt, was true. Passing numerous characters ranging from couples rattling the glass of sex booze to those who used their bodies for cosmetic loans, allowing high-paying clients to grow replacement noses, ears, lips and even penises on their bodies, Marcel began to insist to himself that he was perhaps the most natural of humankind's evolving circus. Marcel began to insist to himself that he was natural. At least flora is natural, he said aloud. The parks were gone from the infected pavements and zones now, with only the fallacy of the hologram gardens in their place. Even the more expensive levels of the city could only boast plastic recreations of once fervent recreation spaces. Marcel removed his visor and smiled at this. Catching his reflection in the window of a preschool tattooist, Marcel was stunned to see that the cacti had evolved into small, circular arrangements of daisies. Daisies! The flowers sat in zealous boutonnieres above his smile, the yellowed hearts shone with newness. Marcel decided to stop for a beer. He opened the door in the pavement and descended the steps, and the chandeliers jangled slightly with the phosphorus draft as Marcel entered the enormous tunnel. Numerous establishments thumped with chatter and clangs beyond the illicit neon frontages. Marcel decided upon the staggered ham. Sitting at a table near to an effigy of a Bahamian sunset, Marcel waited to be served. When he heard the woman's voice, Marcel instinctively looked away, feeling sudden shame for his flower eyes, regardless of them now being daisies, of course. See, he hadn't realised, but Marcel had in fact looked towards a mirror. He blinked his petals with embarrassment, but was quickly distracted by the beauty of the waitress. For a moment, once more dizzied by his condition, Marcel wondered if his idea of the woman's beauty was an effect of the flowers, as if they were acting as a filter. However, turning towards her, very much like flowers pulled towards the sun, Marcel was certain that the woman's beauty was no illusion. He couldn't speak. The waitress lowered her tray and bent towards Marcel, looking at him with her enormous whirlpool eyes. Her head cocked, she stood back and bit her bottom lip, blushing slightly as she did so. "You have the most incredible eyes," she said gently. "They're flowers," Marcel replied. They look like daisies," she said, "actual daisies," and she seemed hypnotised. "They were cacti this morning." Marcel opened them as wide as they would go, but they became daisies when I went out for a walk. "Have they been anything else?" she asked. "Well, they started as tulips a few weeks ago now." "Oh, I love tulips," she said. "I love you," Marcel said without thinking. The waitress laughed and shook her head. "My name's Francesca." My name's Marcel. Marcel with the flower eyes, Francesca whispered. Marcel felt the petals move slightly as Francesca spoke, as if her presence was the summer wind that shakes the wheat. Staring into her eyes, Marcel saw the purest seas and the cleanest coral. He saw depths beyond depths, and he saw clouds that rained gilded birds. He saw hallways and mazes that led to a heart which powered the world. He saw everything. Francesca, he said with the utmost sincerity, I can't explain it, but somehow I think these flowers are for you. Please have dinner with me. And when she smiled in response, Marcel felt his eyes blossom into bouquets. Now, in the first months of their lives together, Marcel's eyes were red roses. With every pulse of romance, the roses bloomed brighter. With each kiss, they became iridescent. With every single night he spent with Francesca, the flowers of his eyes became gardens that stretched to the horizon of his mind. On the day of their wedding, Marcel's eyes became carnations. Glorious in rows of stainless white, they mirrored the amazement he felt just for being with her. Much of the time thereafter, Marcel's eyes were sunflowers, blazing enormously with every opportunity he had to look at his beautiful wife. Occasionally, as the years rolled on and they aged, Marcel's eyes became orchids, awkward but incredible in the complexity of their constructs. The flowers mirrored time's heinous tests, but always his eyes returned to sunflowers when he looked upon her, and roses on occasion when they were afforded time to bloom. Now, Marcel was reading an old novel called The Demolished Man when the communicator beeped to attention. He didn't want to look away from the pages, so agreed to take the call without facing the screen. Accordingly, Marcel did not see the sullen face of the official who stared into his home. Marcel turned to face the stuttering youngster when he heard him say that he was sorry to have to let him know. Once the official had arrived at the part of his speech that mentions Francesca having died, the rest of the call failed to register as anything but hallucinatory bunkum. The words about the accident, the mollifying details of quick and painless passing, all of it swam like fish in crude oil. The words were strangled and lifeless, and when the screen darkened to silence, Marcel walked slowly and abstractedly to the large mirror in the hallway of his home. By the time he'd reached the reflection, Marcel's eyes had become wreaths. As he blinked the deathly arrangements and wept behind them, the petals began to fall, one by one, until all that was left were thorny stems. From that day on, Marcel's eyes were no longer flowers of any kind. Not tulips, cacti, orchids or roses. They were elderly, gummy, human eyes. They were misted by cataracts and bluer than all the moons in the universe. Sometimes, though, when he would wake from a dream about his beautiful Francesca, there would be a single petal on his pillow, and he would hold it in his hand until it shriveled and perished. Now, there were only 6 years that separated Marcel from Francesca. As he began the sonata of his final breaths, lay there in a silent ward, a smile grew slowly across his pallid lips. The nurse on attendance could hear Marcel repeating the name of Francesca over and over and over again. When the nurse returned to his bedside after a short break, she was not surprised to find that Marcel had died. She was, however, astonished to see that his eyes had bloomed into the most wonderful roses she had ever seen. I hope you like that story. I was really pleased with it. I had a good feeling writing that story. I enjoyed it a lot, and it's the most recent story I've completed. So I hope you like it, and I'll be back real soon with some more. All right, all the best. Take care, and thank you again for taking the time.